I know Comrade Diop passed a message saying something about time. I don't know how much it was, but...
10 minutes.
Okay, I got a few minutes, and this is what I think is important. First of all, you're not going to have this discussion. I don't care what organization you were with before. I don't care what group you just came from. I know you've been in a lot of different organizations, but the science that we're trying to bring to this discussion, because we want revolution, we want freedom, we want the emancipation of the African nation. We're defining the African nation. We're dealing with what are really complex questions. You don't have this. When we talk about the African nation, what we are also doing, first of all, we're saying that we're not talking about race, we're talking about the nation. About the nation. And nations, especially in possession of a nation state, or in possession of a revolutionary organization that expresses the aspirations and fighting for the interests of the nation, can enter into relationships with whomever they want in order to carry out those objectives and aspirations. 1. 2, we're trying to define the nation based on science. And so that we are not a nation of Islam, because the nation is not based on some religious whatever kind of affiliation. We said there has to be a sense of sameness. We said that it has to rest upon a real material economic relationship. And what helps to define our relationship, of course, is a relationship of being a host to a parasitic social economy that has come into existence at our expense. If we look at the history of the process, because if you're talking about the nation or any kind of question, I think Lenin was correct when he says you have to look at the whole history of the process. You look at the history of this whole process, talking about the state, that's what we were talking about, but any phenomenon that you want to really understand, you can't understand by simply looking at where it is now. You got to look at the process through which it went to get to where it is now. Isn't that right? So if you're talking about the national question, where do you start? Somebody say it. Where do you start? Do you start in Mississippi? Do you start in Africa? This is fundamental, because your definition, your understanding has to encompass the total, all of the contents of the reality that you're trying to define. And if you are messed up and you suffer from a situation where your reality is restricted, your recognition of your reality is restricted to just your immediate experience, and then you will come up with faulty analysis. Do you understand what I'm saying? Most Africans never leave their communities, whether it's here or whether it's on the continent of Africa. If you try to define the world as your community, you're in trouble. Or if you try to find the world as an African, as Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, North and South Carolina, something, you're wrong. You won't come up with a correct definition. You can't define your reality as this border that they created, they call Ghana, or Nigeria, or Sudan, or Somalia. The whole reality of African people is what we have to bring into this discussion and definition of what the nation is. That's why, and some people take it really subjectively, that's why we oppose to New Africanism as a definition of our reality. We ain't no new African. We're the same old Africans trying to build a new world for African people. And I'm just saying that we're really struggling for science here. That's why we go through all of this discussion. All the discussion we've been going through now is to bring science into the discussion, because we want to have a road map to freedom. And if you end up allowing that definition, listen, how do you come to the term that we suffer in this country because we're new Africans who were enslaved and we came to this thing in Mississippi, Alabama, and all these other places, right? How do you come to that reality without having to explain, well, what about Haiti? How did it get to be that way, right? You got to come up with a whole different reality, explanation for that. Or the Jamaica, or Trinidad, or you got to come up with a whole different reality and understanding what's happening in Congo, Ghana. We're saying it's all a part of the same problem. And the fact is our condition in Africa right now that has been extended to all these different places where we are located. Do you understand? If you're catching hell in Brussels, it's because Europe attacked Africa, kidnapped us, took us to all those places that led us to come to Brussels or to come to this country here. And Africa, and the extension of our condition in Africa is It's what we have brought with us to all these different places. Some people say, oh man, we better off now than we were when we was in Africa. You think you think it's bad where we are, but you could be in Africa. Hell, you are in Africa. It's simply how the oppression. That's why in reggae over here, that's reggae, but it's still African music, right? It's samba over here, but it's still African music. It's the same damn thing that gets expressed differently depending on where we are and what conditions imperialism has imposed on us, to meet the services. You understand what I'm saying? So we're looking for a total definition. So it's not being subjective or, they say this and let's find a new way to say the same thing because we want to build a different organization. So they say this, let's say this. It's not that. We're looking for science here. And that's how we would like to have the debate conducted. And not be mad, not be subjective because you're wrong. Let's deal with it based on, like a scientific kind of approach. And I want to say that the criticism of America is crucial. I go to the continent of Africa, and if you go to like the castles, like the slave castles, to that experience, and every time you go through, you can't go through that without, it breaks you down, it messes you up. The thing that I've always found striking is the guides who take us through there. They know how to work us. They don't have that same experience. We're the only one having that. Why? Because they don't understand what happened to Africa. Negro, they ain't another people over the water that you call Negroes. Those are Africans. Those are your brothers and sisters. Africa is suffering a severe wound. And they need to have the ability to experience this wound in Ghana, in Africa, that we call slavery, just like I experienced the wound. You see? And that's part of what African internationalism helps us to do. That's why African internationalism, we say it's applied science. It's applied philosophy. That's what APDEP is. It's not, we don't just say, okay, we're not arguing on the ground. I mean, we help people, we help through practice, we try to help people come to good ideological and philosophical conclusions. But what is the evidence of what we mean is the fact that a clinic is being built in Sierra Leone as a consequence of the relationship that Africans in Sierra Leone have with Africans all around the world. So it's not some abstract theoretical question. It's a practical thing that people can experience. It's not a government doing it. It's not some government NGO doing it. It's Africans who are bent upon changing the face of the planet Earth as far as African and our oppressions are concerned. So this is real. This is who we are. And I've seen, I was, and I never forget the time. I don't know who in this room might have been with me, but I was in South Africa, and speaking to students, like in the classrooms. And I finished speaking, and this young student came up to me and said, "I want to thank you for helping us to love Africa." Because even how we experience the continent of Africa in Africa itself. There was a brother we used to work with, people in line, so I'm going to stop talking. But let me just say this. Because I used to be distressed. I'd see Minister Louis Farrakhan, like speak in Ghana or someplace like that. Thousands of people come out to hear him speak. Not a single criticism. Not a single criticism of the United States. Not a single criticism of what's happening to African people in America. Not a single criticism of the fact that there's more than 1 million Africans in prison in this country right now. You understand? The Africans on the continent need to know that, because too many people have seen America as this place of salvation, and that impacts on their conscience as well. So I'm going to stop for a minute and let people come to the mics. Huh? Oh, yes, correct. Let me say while he's fixing whatever he's fixing, that we're not talking about creating and building a racial nation. And what the nation looks like depends on what we do. We are revolutionaries. The African revolutionary has the responsibility of consolidating the African nation. That's the added task. That's what the African proletariat. That's what the revolutionary African proletariat has the responsibility to do. We do that consolidation. We define that. The imperialist, bourgeois, the European nation was born as a bourgeois nation with all of its prejudices and everything else associated with it. Our nation is not going to be a nation in the final run, even though we can say that there are various kinds of objective and material conditions that contribute to our definition of a nation, that ours is not going to be a nation based on religion and based on other kind of artificial things that will be used as the basis for oppressing and exploiting anybody. Yes, comrade.
Yeah, I just wanted to unite with the question of nation, because it's even key as we're talking now in Africa, like in the Congo, for example, is a critical question because like all the war that's going on now through the 9 borders, according to the Berlin Conference, is also due to the fact that the definition of nation is not a scientific definition. Like now, with you know, the outcome of the election, like the nationalism has risen in the minds of our people, and like with the wrong conclusion, like nation. Like we see Rwanda or the neighbors as a problem because nation just is, even in the brain, the nation is just limited to the Berlin kind of stuff, you know, borders.
Yes.
And, you know, one thing when I got to Europe for the first time, like in Britain, where like our people say I'm black British and stuff like that. And one thing I realized is like the European, they say, you know, England, you know, land, because they always talk about land, like, Ireland, England, you can't be British or something.
England, our land.
Yeah, our land is always their land because you welcome here. You can be here for a million years. You can be British or black British or something else, but you can never be English because English means the land, you know. The land belongs to us, even Iceland, all the land. So that shocked me. I'm like, Dutch land. The Germans said Dutch land. So they all have lands. And if you're black British, there's no land for you. And like I was in Brussels looking for, you know, Saturday night out club, and I saw this guy and said, do you know any kind of place where they play African music? He told me, I don't know, but, you know, we're going to Brazilian music, samba. So you say samba, and, you know, samba is lingala, basically. Like it's a popular term that we use in Africa, samba. There's plenty name, masamba and stuff like that. So the guy said samba, but it's not for you, you know. So it was claiming Brazil, you know, the culture of African culture in Brazil for themselves. And, you know, these kind of things really shock me, like every time you go through Europe. And like one thing I tell people every time when we go to the question of nation is the role that the church or Vatican played in shaping the worldview of Europeans. Like this is exactly what we're doing here. Like I'm not saying we the Vatican or a church, but this is a place where you come to see the world as African people should see the world. Our view, like, so is really key. Like, you know, African internationalism play the role, like the central role that the Vatican play to shape how African people should view the world. And, you know, I say we're in the right word.
Uhuru, come back.
Uhuru, Chairman. Uhuru, that was a magnificent presentation, and by you and by Secretary General Luwezi, and hopefully that could go up soon on Uhuru News. I wanted to ask you about when you were saying that the white nation is white and Christian, and you talked about Jews, but yet in the real world, Jews, whether in the U.S. or Europe or South Africa or certainly Israel, sit on the pedestal very clearly.
Yes.
And are part of the white nation, or how does that, and also increasingly, certainly in this country, a lot of Asians, increasingly Arabs, you know, Chinese, Japanese, sit on the pedestal very clearly of the oppression of Africans and indigenous. So just how does that, you know, because, and I'm raising that because as you know, people of other nationalities sometimes come to APSC to be in the organization under the leadership of the party. Could you just say a little bit?
I'm not saying that there are not other groups who do not enjoy a parasitic relationship to the African world or to Africa itself. In fact, one of the interesting contradictions we've had in this country is, if you remember the case of Sami al-Arian, Palestine, who was a Palestinian patriot, was, for the national liberation of Palestine, from the perspective of the Palestinian, petty bourgeoisie. But radical to that extent that he was even considered some kind of threat, jailed, put in prison, that kind of stuff. But it used to be striking that he would make these speeches because he was in a constant process of trying to win America to acceptance of the cause of the Palestinian people. And some of them have developed a strategy close to the Zionists, where if they work with the government and the political parties, make contributions to them, etc., they assume that they can get the same kind of benefits from America that the Zionists have made for Israel. So he would make speeches like that, this is not China, like this is America, and America stands for this and that. And he went to prison. And we wanted to defend him in prison. And, he wrote a book, Sami al-Arian or something, and standing for all of these things in the American way. And his appeal was, that he shouldn't be in jail, more or less. But we couldn't support him after a period of time, because to support him was to support America and our own oppression, even though he was in jail. And what it is the reality is that in this country, that African people and the indigenous people who are in these concentration camps and in these barrios are the only people who did not come here pursuing a better way of life, but lost a better way of life as a consequence of having come here. And all the accessible value, ability to function like in the economy is parasitic. And Palestinians come here, open their stores in the African community where we can't get along, and treat us in many ways just like the Zionists treat Palestinians in occupied Israel, in occupied Palestine. And other people come here too. And I'm not talking about subjectively whether they like black people or anything like that. I'm talking about their objective relationship to this economy and to us is parasitic, and that's just an objective reality. So I'm not saying that there are not forces, including Jews, because the reality is that when I was growing up, that wasn't a Palestinian there, and that wasn't an Indian that was a Jew. There was a Jew in our communities who actually said that we're doing you a favor because the other white people wouldn't do this. This was Jews took up that part of the exploitation of the community because that was above white people, other white people to do that. So Jews did that. And then Jews used this as a part of the entree into like the upper echelons, like of white society. That's how they get into the banks and other kinds of things like that. Offer that kind of relationship. So I want to say two things. One is that despite all of that, in terms of for Jews to be accepted as a part of the European nation and all their whiteness, they have to also remove their Jewishness. Doesn't mean that the European nation will not use their presence in a certain way. But there is this long history in Europe of Christians, who use as an ideological basis for it. The ideological basis for it is the Jews killing this other Jew 2,000 years ago, they say. They say the Jews kill a Jew, right? Talking about, because that's what Jesus was, a Jew. He was a Jew. And he did run afoul of traditional, if you will, Jewish stuff, because the Jews, the Hebrews, were oppressed by the Romans, and he participated in a rebellion to overturn that. And so I'm not saying, and so that becomes the ideological basis. Not necessarily the material basis, but that becomes the ideological basis because Christianity is so fundamental up to now, right now, to the definition of white people. That's why all these elections, that's why everybody's got to be in the elections. You know, now what is happening, if you notice, the evangelicals, the Christian fundamentalists have concluded that support of Israel, now, and these are from the places where people have been most anti-Jew, right? In this camp, now, you know, running to the support of Israel because there's some kind of biblical thing that has to do with either when once Israel, something happens to Israel, then that means the Jew who they kill, who the white people kill, the other white people kill 2,000 years ago, is going to come back and free the world, right? I mean, that's when Jesus was, some relationship like that. They've concocted this. And they've concocted it, why? Because the state of Israel, as a tool of imperial white power, has been fundamental for a period of time. And it's hard, and so, yeah, Jews have functioned just like other white people. So they've had the certain benefits of their whiteness, etc., but they have not been accepted as a part of the white nation. That's all of the European nation. Mm-hmm. And there are other white people, similar white people. I mean, look at Turks, mm-hmm. you know, and who have their own contradictions with Arabs today. You know, that's kind of hard to get to because of the Islamic question. You know, because the Turkish, what do you call it, Ottoman Turks, the spread of Islam and etc. through them. So, I mean, it's contradictory. There are contradictions there. I'm not saying that this what we're talking about now is not without contradiction. Mm-hmm. But if you look at the whole thing, if you look at the whole picture, and you're also talking about contradictions among these white people in terms of the consolidation of the European nation. The other thing I would say is that just because the European nations look one way today doesn't mean that it won't be necessary for it to change tomorrow. And it may be in a state of transition right now. I mean, when you got Buchanan and Brzezinski and everybody talking about the demographic change in the whole world and how people are running from their whiteness, etc., and whiteness is also trying to bring other people in. You got a situation where Eurabia, as referred to, because so many Arabs are having to come to Europe to do the labor, etc. So I don't think it's a static question. And even they are requiring more. When they say they're looking for good Muslims, you know, they're looking for good Muslims. Not them other Muslims, you know, who are talking about blow up this and jihad. They're looking for good Muslims. What do they mean? What do they mean?
Muslims that ain't resistant.
Say it again. Not just Muslims who are not resistant, but Muslims. Say it. No, Muslims who now are becoming more, assuming more of the identity of whiteness, to assuming more of the sense of sameness, to get rid of the minarets, to take off the, you know, all the stuff that, associated with Islam, and so that does not become your primary identity. They want to challenge that primary identity and have them, just like a good Negro, right? And just because you got a good Negro, some of whom live at the expense of other black people, that don't mean the white nation still ain't white, right? It means that it offers up, you know, a capacity for some people to participate, you know, in the process, in the service of the white nation, even though they don't have the kind of status in some ways. But that's like I said, I really think it's in a state of transition. That's even where like the Portuguese created the assimilado. The assimilado. And in some instances, what happens here in this country and other places, the children of the slave master, the light-skinned children of the slave master were given certain privileges. They had privileges. And in our communities, they had privileges, and we were taught something. We gave them privileges too, just like the bourgeoisie gave them privileges. They were the trusted ones, etc. The Portuguese created a group of people they called assimilados. These were African people. You didn't even have to be light-skinned and curly-haired and all that kind of stuff. In fact, you could be Amilcar Cabral, you know, come from that group that they characterized as assimilados. They became more Portuguese than the Portuguese. The Portugal was backwards. It was the majority of people uneducated, etc. But to become an assimilado, you had to have a higher cultural development than ordinary Portuguese. So that happens, you know, but it still did not make them not Africans. It made them less, it made them, that was where we say the material, the objective reality is different from their subjective assumptions and of, you know, like of who they had. And even if they might have had money and stuff like that, but they were still niggers. You know, in fact, they were really nice to have at the tea parties and stuff like that. Did you invite in the Simulado? Have a good nigger to come, and it's entertaining. It's a thing that you're going to have a big old party and make sure you have some niggers there who, not just as servants and stuff like that, but they, you know, become an element of, what do you call it? Somebody who goes to parties. You know what I'm talking about, don't you? Where it becomes an element of, it gives an element of there's a statue there, but there's a, you know, like an exotic flair to the party to give it, you know, a little color, you know, that kind of thing, you know. So, so, but I understand the point you're making. And was there something else you were going to say, Comrade?
No, that's all. Thank you.
All right, Uhuru. Okay. Okay, so we have to move quickly because I'm being warned.
Well, I just want to say real quick, we are 12 minutes past the time we're supposed to end. I do understand this is an important discussion, so, you know, I want to open it up to our program coordinator, our program committee, if we can extend the amount of time to allow for the remaining questions.
And brief responses.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, we're going to be brief because that's.
Okay.
Yeah. Uhuru.
My question was about when you were talking about the consolidation of the African nation and the subjective factors like appearance, like a lot of Africans look alike, and I was just wondering if that's really a subjective thing because.
No, that's an objective factor,
okay.
A physiognomy, but it's subjective. It has both features. It's subjective in the sense that, you know, when I see this comrade, you know, I mean, there's a subjective response that allows me to say, hey, this is, in the same way whiteness, even though it's an objective reality, there's a subjective factor to it that allows for a certain identity. And I've heard people joke that, that to see a white person in Africa, right, looking for other white people, you know, is similar to experiences that we have all the time. We're in the middle of the sea of white people and see somebody African, you know. So that's a subjective and objective, you know, reality, yeah.
Okay, and I was just wondering if you could comment on that in relation to, like, you've talked about how it's not a biological analysis, and there's more to it than that in terms of consolidating the African nation. Like, for example, if there were people somewhere in North Africa that were to call, you know, the Uhuru House and say, we want to form the African People's Socialist Party, Libya, or something like that, it wouldn't be like, no, you can't do that because your skin is not black.
It wouldn't be. In fact, at a really important time in the history of the development of what is now referred to as Pan-Africanism, NASA, you know, played a significant role in the so-called Pan-Africanist movement, along with Nkrumah and some other people. And at that juncture, they were able to identify themselves as Africans. Same thing was true of Ben Bella in Algeria. In fact, Ben Bella took a better stance as an African than black, you know, somebody in Zambia who was the president at that time, you know, around being an African. And this will happen too in terms of consciousness. Because the stronger the black liberation movement gets on the continent of Africa, many people who now call themselves Arabs and other things will want to be known as Africans. And we've seen that happen in the past. It'll happen again. So no, we're not talking about that. But we are talking about this, that the loyalty has to be to the African nation and developing the African nation. And that's not just a concept. Because we say there's an objective and subjective factor to this. I mean, struggling against the kind of parasitism, because the Arabs have played a certain parasitic role in Africa. In many ways, that is an ongoing contradiction that has to be resolved, that seldom gets talked about. And that has to be broken up, busted up. This whole parasitic relationship that they've had, that's going to be a condition. They're going to have to they're going to have to be in a situation where their declaration of Africanness is going to have to be associated with taking, as Che Guevara saying, sharing the same fortune, whether in victory or death. They're going to have to have a practical relationship that they would share the same fortune as the majority of African people, and not as some privileged group that can now be African because the tables are being turned. In the same way in southern Africa, a lot of white people who are conveniently Africans now because the march of history is taking back our resources and our lives for ourselves. Uhuru Kamara.
Wudu Chairman,
Yeah.
Quick comment and then a question. Dealing with the question of the nation, I'm reminded of a time Comrade Diop and myself went to Venezuela, and Diop, he made his presentation on why we need the ASI in Latin America, for Africans there. And he ended his presentation with "One Africa, One Nation" in Spanish. And, people were clapping. They were very receptive
Right.
to this idea, right? And after his presentation was over, this petty bourgeoisie African professor from Howard gets up there and says, "No, it's not one Africa, one nation, because Africa is so diverse and there's so many languages and cultures and customs, just like there is here in Venezuela." And then people started clapping for that. And I'm like, he just shit on our whole thing. But the people there and the Africans in Venezuela, they don't know any better, They see the so-called African left in Latin America is the petty bourgeoisie, and that's who's leading the so-called African left movement there and their ideology. That's why it's so important that this ASI conference that's coming up in April happen in the Caribbean, because the people there need this theory. They need to list. They need that the question of the nation needs to be defined for them. So my question is, I know that the Marxists have,
will you forget your question if I interrupt you briefly?
No.
That's one of the things that I like about Comrade Diop. Comrade Secretary General, remember when we were in Holland? We were in Holland together, and we were at this meeting of this Maoist, Marxist meeting, and in a sea of Maoists and Marxists who spoke very strange languages, and it was hard to even. And some of them from the U.S., but they were from everywhere, from the Philippines, from where was that? India. They were, from, I think there was somebody there from Iraq, Iran, all of these Marxists and what have you. And one of them probably, I would assume, is related to the politic of that comrade. Remember on the other day when we were talking and somebody emailed in about the situation in Iran and whether that was objectively, like an anti-imperialist struggle, where the communists, that I had met at that meeting was opposed. It was almost like a pro-imperialist kind of thing because they could not see, that we had to defend, like the regime from, like the imperialists to keep the imperialists from carrying out their objective. But anyway, they were defining the crisis. They were talking about the crisis of imperialism, and they defined it as due to overproduction. And I never forget Comrade Diop. He stood up and he went to the mic and he said something to the effect, that the crisis of imperialism, is due, like to the resistance of peoples around the world, and the way you're addressing it is like it's some kind of, financial, issue of the books not balanced right or something to that effect, And I really appreciate that because he was grappling with it. That's what I liked about it, is because he was still struggling himself, with the issue and didn't, necessarily know how to contend with them, but he stood up. I mean, there was no discussion. We didn't say, "Hey, Diop, go say something," And I loved it because he walked right up and he grabbed the mic and he threw down on them. And that's what Diop did. And I was appreciative, and I'm glad that he, went and exercised his Spanish acumen and
It's quite good, actually. Diab Spanish. More than we let on, yeah. But,
May I say that Diab it's really interesting. There was a brother who was in our party, and we didn't talk about this even in my report that much, but and perhaps not at all. But we were in Nicaragua in 1981 when Reagan was inaugurated. And, you know, we were really close to the Sandinistas. Here, too, we had a real close relationship. And so they had a problem that they tried to get me to participate in resolving. Some of the Sandinistas did on the Atlantic coast. If you know, the Atlantic coast is different from other parts of Nicaragua because that's where the British, you know, came in and brought Africans from various places, and in particular in Jamaica and other places like that. And so it's extremely underdeveloped, and English is the language there, so it's a real contradiction. It was also a place that CIA used that as a form of penetration to attack the Sandinista revolution because it had never been consolidated as a part of Nicaragua proper. In fact, they refer to the Nicaraguans as the Spaniards. That's how those comrades living in blue fields and other things like that. So we sent somebody into Nicaragua who helped to develop the autonomy program. It wasn't, you know, as he said, exactly what we wanted, but we helped to develop that autonomy program in Nicaragua. It's really interesting because I hadn't seen or heard from this comrade in many years. He married a woman there in Nicaragua, and then when Diab was talking, we were talking about something. I don't remember what it was. Turns out that his professor, where he was going to school in Texas, right, was the guy who we sent there. So Diab met Edmundo, or Ted, as he was called Edmundo there. He was Ted when he left here. Gordon, what's his name, Gordon? Yeah, and so it's really just mind-blowing that Diab met this guy there, and I don't know, of course that probably has nothing to do with his Spanish, but go ahead.
Before I get to my question, it's interesting that you bring that up about Nicaragua and the Africans there in the Atlantic. Because in Colombia, actually, there's an island that's off the coast of Nicaragua that's property of Colombia. It's closer to Nicaragua, and there's like been historical dispute, but it's actually part of Colombia. It's called San Andreas. And the Africans there, when they took the census in Colombia, and they finally, recognized that there's Africans in Colombia, they said, let's put something on the census that for Africans to check that says I'm Afro-Colombian. So the Africans on that island next to Nicaragua said, no, we're not Afro-Colombian, we're descendants from the British. So we want a special category. So that, it's crazy. This whole question of the nation is something that really we have to address when we go into Latin America.
Not just there, but go ahead, comrade. What you want to say?
I was going to go to my question, but
okay.
My question was that I know that Marxists have their definition of what a nation is, and they list the different things. And even Nkrumah has a definition. And I mean, we came out, we as African internationalists, we have our own definition of what the nation is. And I wanted to know if you could just quickly or briefly just explain the differences between the three and why ours is the correct
Well, first of all, the Marxists have usually the definition that was... Yes, go ahead, come on. Okay, we don't have much time. The Marxist definition is based on something that Stalin put forth primarily. In fact, it's called Marxism and the National Question. And he came up with, about 5 different characteristics and saying the absence of either of these means that it's not a nation. It had to do with language. You had to have a common language, live on common territory, common history and culture, common spiritual or cultural thing, and territory. All, living on the same territory base. If either one of these things was missing, he said, you didn't have a nation, which is... But Stalin's definition simply was one, there was debate happening all over Europe, and Stalin took elements of 2 different positions that was out there and combined that to come up with the question of the nation. I'm saying that simply to say that what Stalin said was not half of what was on the mythological stone that Moses walked down with these laws on it. It wasn't like that. Stalin, was involved in solving a particular problem at that time to try to consolidate the working class, what they characterized as working class revolutionary movement, and had to do that through breaking up these concepts of national identity that existed throughout Europe, especially the Jewish Bund and other kinds of entities who were trying to do their own thing. They were saying, hey, all of us, like the working class, and that this national question is, the way you're doing it is wrong. Here's what nations are. They were trying to solve a particular problem. That's what Stalin was doing when he wrote it. And I think it's important to say that it's not in the Bible or something like that. That's what they needed to solve a problem. And that's the thing that's been out there, in the world in terms of defining, what the nation is. And Nkrumah's was based on Stalin's, with the exception, he said that a nation doesn't necessarily have to, what did he say? Did he say something about the economic, doesn't have to live in the same place? It doesn't have to necessarily be on the same land base. He made an exception to that. I've forgotten exactly what that exception was. But it was based more or less on the Stalin's definition. And what we're saying is that the nation, first of all, we give the historical basis for the nation in the first place, why it's there. It's not, and that's really important because it served a function. The development, the concept of the nation served a function in terms of trying to move, provide, contributing to, you're talking about a group of people who have to participate in production, and have to be so have to be, so defined in the form of production we're talking about is capitalist production, etc. So that required, like a certain a definition to consolidate those people. We're talking about a group of people who have been divided by that process that created the European nation, and who have to come together in order to liberate ourselves. And in the process of doing, we undermine the existence of the European nation itself that rests upon our oppression. That's a condition of its own existence and definition as a nation. So primarily what we're saying, black people are part of the nation. Black people are part of the nation. And we said some of the reasons why that is the case, and it can be even more complicated because we're talking about people who are from Australia. We're talking about, people who suffer the consequences of being black in the world. That helps to shape a certain consciousness among ourselves, and certainly it helps other people to recognize them a certain way, for particular white people in the world who have the power to recognize them as a certain way too. That creates a certain sense of sameness, a sense of, and so that's an objective reality, but there's also subjective in the sense that people who are black do feel an affinity and experience an affinity with each other, share the same kinds of culture, generally culture, eat the same kinds of food. Even though you go and you eat Indian food, you eat Ethiopian food, you got the same spices and other kinds of things. It's the same taste. You go to a Jamaican restaurant in a white community, you don't like the food because they've taken the spices out to satisfy a white palate, and because white people can't stand the heat. But the point is that the same, we got the same, kinds of, same cultural and spiritual kind of thing you'll find there. That's consistent, generally speaking. That's what Louisa was talking about when he was talking about even names and stuff. You find the same all over the place. So that's one. Even you find African women who live in this country who had never been to Africa, never know nothing about Africa. You can tell an African name of this child, an African child. You hear the name, you know that's a black woman's child. They say, well, what kind of name is that? That's an African name. Where part of Africa it came from? It came from that woman there who wanted to give her child a distinct name that was not a white. It wasn't Mary Jo or anything like that, right? It's Shanika. It's, all these other kinds of things that we do. It's a part of stuff. It's a part of the identity. And it sounds just like it could be from the continent. Probably is from the continent. But that's a part of the reality. So culture, et cetera, obviously that's one thing. History, common history is another factor, right? And a really important defining factor is the economic exploitation that we all owe our existence in most of us in various places around the world to the economic exploitation of Europe, of us, that resulted in us being in the shape we're in today. We can do a better job in terms of definition, but that's at least an important component of what the definition that we would use to, because ours is a definition that places us in real comprehensive anti-imperialist trajectory. And it's a revolutionary thing that we're looking for. We don't borrow the racial concept of the bourgeoisie that's used to, divide people, to keep the world in a certain way based on exploitation, oppression. That's why this question of Africans who live in the northern part of Africa and other places like that, we're not bothered, by the way they look. If we were, we'd have a problem with people in the damn room. You understand what I'm saying? Everywhere you go in Africa, you find people with all kinds of complexions, all on the continent and off the continent. That's the reality that we're faced with. So those are some of the things, and I think we can do better. Comrade, I bet you Mwalimu here is going to come up with something that's really more definitive than what I've said, but works with the same general concepts that I just laid out.
Yeah, I look forward to that.
Uhuru, yeah.
Hey, Uhuru. My question is dealing with, as a mom again, with education, and I will, so I won't get misunderstood. For me, most importantly, I'm taking my kids out of school. And I started with homeschooling because I was a woman that speaks 6 languages, that's lived in Brazil, lived in Cuba, lived in Jamaica, lived in Haiti. Because I was with a pilgrimage, and I was the only socialist. I considered myself that from the beginning because of what's happened here from America. I found that everything that I taught my kids, they know Yoruba, they know Islam, they know how to speak different Arabic, And then when I put them into Pan-Africanism, and they learned certain things about Mayad and Malcolm X, what happened was then there was that thing with materialism. And so for me, in trying to build now with my school for my children, homeschooling, I believe the Socialist Party for me will be to help me support this curriculum. Because I feel like with them knowing who they are, they don't want to say, Nkosi Sikelele Africa no more. They don't want to go back to the things they want. My daughter wanted to cut her dreads, because being in that and a part of the movement, I wasn't able to sustain, and we haven't been able to sustain an educational system that really talked about materialism and wanting to be a part when you're different because you know who you are. And so going to take them to Brazil, and I'm going to take them to South Africa where we met with Nelson Mandela on this pilgrimage, and then taking them to Cuba and Jamaica, all these places that I was able to go to because I was a documentary filmmaker. I feel like I'm really interested to hear how can a curriculum for a child, like my kids can sit here and they'll ask me questions after today on things they heard because they see it on a different level than we do because they want to belong as children. So my son who knows Africa got in trouble with the teacher, okay? And he wasn't strong enough to say with the other kids, well, leave it alone, I won't play drums anymore. He doesn't want to play drums anymore because he's different. And to take them again out of the system because of my mindset, them knowing that I am a socialist mother, I'm different than, what Pan-African means to me is not just here in America. It's also with those brothers and sisters I lived with in Brazil, in Belarino, and and why we speak. And I speak to them in 6 languages sometimes because they don't even want me to speak the languages. I want to know, how do you develop a curriculum to almost say what you said before? We don't go anywhere when we're in this country. Africans don't come here. And building that curriculum for children to understand that when we bring them up in a socialist party, they will be better and not afraid and go combat this materialism that I'm having a problem with.
Uhuru. The one thing that happens is that African internationalism means resistance and struggle and revolutionary transformation, because when you met Mandela, he was still a puppet of U.S. imperialism. He was still a servant of the oppressor. He was still in the process of creating a situation that allows where the majority of Africans in South Africa now starving, impoverished, and just a handful of Negroes, including Mandela, being wealthy at their expense. Socialism certainly would prohibit that kind of relationship. The other thing is that it's not just that we recognize black people in all these different places as kin, but that we also recognize them as a part of the same oppressed nation that cannot ever know happiness in the future unless this relationship that it has with imperialism is overturned. Knowing, for example, that African people created peanut butter is not worth a hill of beans if we don't know that, okay, we created peanut butter, but Peter Pan owns it. And there's a contradiction here that's really profound, you know. And I'm just saying that, that we have to create the curriculum that you're talking about, but that curriculum has to be one that is a curriculum of resistance and help us to raise and rear revolutionaries, people who have to engage in overturning a social system. And I am impressed by your need to create such an institution as that. Because we want to, that's something we've been working on and for a long time. We have to do that. But I think it's really, so I'm impressed with that. That's something that we want to take on and will take on. But again, it's not just our blackness. There's what you know, our worldview is. And like Mandela is you know, it would be hard for me to say enough negative expletives to define Mandela and what he and the ANC have done to our people in South Africa and other places. And there are a lot of Negroes like that around, including Barack Hussein Obama. They are not the people. They are not our Africa. Our Africa is in the process of being born. What it is that we have to do is to be engaged in the process of giving birth to this Africa, you know, that our children, you know, can have a future in. And the thing that's really helpful here is the work we do and how the world is changing. Increasingly now, you start finding white people trying to grow dreads and become Shanikas and all of this kind of stuff as well. So the world's going to catch up with your children. My son used to be, he had problems because all his friends were Roberts and Johns, and he was a weird kid, you know, with the weird name. You know, where the hell a name like that comes from? You know, ooga booga kind of stuff. You know how they lay it on our children and stuff, you know? But watch and see how we'll be seeing in the short term. You know, his white friends are going to be saying ooga booga. You know, his white, they will, the world is changing and they will have, that's who's going to end up changing. Yeah. Whites are having to change and transform based on the work that we do and how the world is changing, you know, around them. But I understand the struggle that you're talking about. And these children, the other thing I want to say about that is that the vast majority of Africans are not going to homeschool and won't be able to do that. But they're stuck in those institutions, which are bastions of racial hatred. Mm-hmm. So even if we are able to do things like homeschool and create our own institutions, we have to build a force that will attack those other institutions, defend our children, transform them to the extent that it's possible to make it, because that's where the vast majority of our children are going to be. They're not going to be, you know, doing that. So we have to be fighting it from, you know, like different.
And that's where the inconsistency happened for me, according to my grandmother, who made me go to church 7 days a week. Yeah. Which was, okay, I brought them homeschooling. Then when economics went down, I had to put them in school. Sure. And then when it wasn't working for me because they were making my kids fight more about who they were, because her is Yehudith Oyentore Esota Torre, and he's Akasa Asada La Justice. You know, they changed their names to, not change their names, they condensed their names when they used to be proud. I used to have them stand up in the morning and say it. But I think what happened is consistently, for me, the economics has been, I haven't been able to keep them in or out because homeschooling takes a lot of money, especially when I'm still, I believe in organizing every day I get up. So, you know, that's the piece too, how economically I'm trying to find like the money I save to go away sometimes once a year and to support others, you know, where we are as far as the struggle to unite. You know, because
but organizing has to mean building organization too. Right. Because your children need to be in an atmosphere of organization where people like them are around them all the time in the organizations that we create, where there are plenty of other children in, you know, that's going to be one of the things that reinforce their identity, where people who are not us as parents, because they look at us a certain way, you know, we come a certain way, but other children like them, you know, are proud in the same company that they are in and have, you know, recognize the same mission. You know, that's the thing that will reinforce them more than anything, because you know how the problem we have with the preacher's son. You know, the preacher's son is the one who, resisting all those restrictions and stuff that was placed on him at home, goes out and becomes the one that robs the banks and do the drugs and do all those other kinds of things because of how they experience that. We have to create societies. And in this instance, I'm talking about organization and things like that, where these children experience other children, you know, involved with the same kind of consciousness and the same recognition, involved in the same mission. And they do it with flair, and they're cool with it. Because parents aren't cool. Parents aren't cool, but other children can be cool, you know, and they need to be in an environment of coolness with others, you know, etc. I know there's a lot to be said on this. Yes, Mafrika, and I am being pushed. We got to be pushed, comrade. So if I don't say nothing after you say something, call it a miracle. Yes, Mafrika. I'm glad to see this brother here. This brother here said we got to take African internationalism not only into Memphis, Tennessee, where he's located, and I don't know if I can get some of these comrades to go back to Memphis. Memphis was an interesting experience, but also back into Mississippi. And I agree with him. Go ahead, brother.
Uhuru.
Uhuru.
I have a quick question. What is your response around the national question to Africans here who reject or just throw the whole question under the bus because they say they grew up watching Andy Griffin or Sanford and Son, and so therefore they have no identity, or you're American, so you really can't do that, or they say Africans on the continent reject us anyway.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, people say all kinds of things with limited information, and that's what we're talking about, because they say they ain't like us and that kind of stuff. And the reason they say it because they ain't never been in a situation where they see Africans everywhere just alike. You go, no matter where you go on the continent, if you don't go on the continent, if you don't go as a tourist, if you go there as an African, you find out everybody accepts you as an African. If you go there as a tourist, you get treated like a tourist, no matter what color you are. That's the reality. And so when I go to Africa, I've never seen a situation where we reject you because you're African. In fact, you know, like I said, I've had more of the response of, wow, you know, thank you for, for helping us to love Africa. I've met people who would say things, they'd be mind blown. You know, you like Africa, you want to stay here, and of course I do. Every time I go to Africa, it's harder to come back to this sucker. And if I didn't have this water wage on this end against this power here, I wouldn't be here. But they can't believe that you want to be in Africa, etc. So you find people with limited amount of information. They think that they're not like Africans because they ain't been in situations with Africans, and they see that we got the same. They say we ain't got no African. Yes, you got African culture. You just ain't been in a place where it's expressed in a certain way. I go to South Africa, and one of the complaints I hear from brothers, comrades in South Africa is that we've lost our culture. And then they say, and I'll tell you more after I come back off the mountain where I have to go up there and go through this traditional circumcision. You know, you know what I'm saying? And they have an experience of having, quote unquote, lost their culture because there's this assumption of what culture is and how we experience culture. And if your base of reference is so narrow that you don't have the ability to, you think you know about, you think you know, all Coca-Cola and Kool-Aid is all that, you know, you think that's what you're into, and you don't, but the reality is even after you finish your Coke, you drink your Coke in a black community with people with certain traditions, habits, etc., that we don't call culture. In fact, sometimes, or if they call it culture, they call it a culture of some kind of pathology, some kind of disease, some kind of problem, because you haven't become properly civilized. But we are the same culture, and so it's just a real narrow, you know, level of understanding that they have, and we have to, you know, and when I say narrow understanding, I ain't talking about that stuff that these cultural Negroes do, where they take this sort of Jewish Black Christmas that I know y'all practice every year, that they call Kwanzaa with the seven candles. What y'all call that? What's that called, Ruby? The thing that, say what? Menorah. You know, the red, black, and green menorah. That y'all call Kwanzaa. Yeah, that's really what we were missing in the revolution of Black Christmas. Can you say, oh, let's solve a problem we got, let's have a Black Christmas here called Kwanzaa? Isn't that something? And that was done by a damn FBI agent informant in the first place. But I don't mean that. I mean, culture is much more comprehensive. And what is culture in the final analysis? habits and traditions that people develop in the process of creating and recreating real life. And what prevents Africans from creating and recreating real life? What is it? Somebody say it. Imperialism. And so what would African culture look like then if it's genuine, legitimate African culture? What would it look like? Somebody say it. Resistance to imperialism. If you're talking about African culture, you know, for it to be legitimate, real culture, not just trapped in the past, right? To stuff you used to do in the past, because in the past, the thing that made it relevant was that it was associated with the process of creating and recreating real life. That's what the drum was about. That's what everything that we were doing was about. And that was a part of that. So a genuine culture of the slave is a culture of resistance. So when we're doing the drums now, you know, it provides the beat, you know, like on the way to make the revolution, doesn't it? You know, it's the things in our brain that, the melody that, or the beat that, that keeps us awake, when we, like in the bush, right? And many of the dances and ceremonies that you have that we refer to as culture in Africa, they're all associated with some form of resistance, which is why the sun dance was prohibited by white people in this country for the so-called Indians. Because the sun dance, that was a serious business, boy. And you ever notice in any old movies that you used to look at, go back to some of the old movies where it has to do with Indians or Africans, and then what you hear in the middle of the night, the drums, right? The drums. And guess what? It ain't no reggae party that's out there, you understand? The drums was a powerful threat. And it was a cultural phenomenon that's tied to the resistance of our people. And to solve, that's all I want to say on that. So yeah, make the struggle, but the real struggle that we're gonna make is with the burning spear in our hands, selling the spear. This is the culture that we are talking about. It's not gonna be some abstract discussion that we just have with people about Africa. It's going to be people who take the cruise and go to Jamaica with us to meet Garvey's, family, and go to the Mayan ruins with us, where we're not, that's not no going back to ancient Egypt and stuff, but we're talking about the resistance, talking about the advent of Africans in the Americas and those contributions. It's going to be about knowing, the role of people like Denmark Vesey and people like Patrice Lumumba. If you, it's appalling. We go to African festivals, they're older Africans, and on the wall, and depending on where you are, there's a picture of a white Jesus and some other white people and Martin Luther King. Where is Lumumba? Where is the resistance, that we should be informed by? That's what we are. And you're going to run into resistance immediately when you start trying to take this message out, because imperialism has the brains of our people and has always worked to define us to ourselves. It didn't just define us to the world. It defines us to ourselves. And in fact, it couldn't be effective if we hadn't accepted its definition of ourselves that it has imposed on us. And it didn't do it easily. It came with blood and guns. And it came with torture, and what you call exemplary torture that would help people to understand that if you believe this is what happened to you, nigga. And it's tearing off limbs and castrating people and mass rapes and all these stuff is done in order to intimidate a population into not accepting who it is and what it has to do. And so a lot of it is punkism. It's easier to believe what the white man said, because if you believe something else, you're going to have to do something about it. It's punkism. It's cowardly. And people have been cowed down, beaten down. And what you do, your stance as an African internationalist, it was something that would help them to have the courage to think the right thoughts. That's what we have to do. We have to help people have the courage to think the right thoughts. Because some stuff that we're talking about, people know it instinctively. Negro look in the mirror, they know they're Africans. They hate being Africans because of what they've been taught about Africa, about white people. So you help them see a new African, and I don't mean the new I mean a new African image, a new force, that this is the African that I represent, and I'm going at imperialism, and I don't want you to get in the way, so you better hurry up and sign up. You know, I've talked too long, and this comrade has been quite patient with me, and I really appreciate that. There's much I would like to share with you. Please read the political report to the 5th Congress, where we talk a bit about the nation, and I'm particularly interested in you really grappling with the concept of the withering away of nations. We've referenced it at different times, and I think it's a really important concept. You know, and the Marxists, as I said, you know, talk about communism, which is that state in human history where there is no exploitation, no oppression, etc., no class societies. That communism is that time when after the early stages, which people call socialism, the withering away of the state has been accomplished. The problem for the Marxists is that they have not been able to connect the reality that the capitalist state itself was born, the capitalist nation itself, the imperialist European nation and the capitalist state, you know, were born together. The European state was born wrapped in the skin. The capitalist state was born wrapped in the skin of racialized European nation. And when we liberate Africa and African people and consolidate the existence of the African nation, we at the same time put in motion the process of the withering away of nations themselves. And the Marxists didn't get that, because they didn't get the fact that the state they want to see withering away came wrapped in the skin, you know, of this European nation that was born at the expense of everybody else. We say the withering of the state, we create the conditions for the withering away of the state with the withering away of the nation as a consequence of the consolidation of the African nation. That's the starting point of the withering away of nations as such, and therein the withering away of nations and the advent of communism. Uhuru.